housekeeping bill. Mr. Baker and Bill A. to the PSC, the Public Service Commission bills. 209 extends from 45 to 90 days after a gas utility filing to either approve or plan. So that's all this does. Actually, it only affects one company, Atmos Energy, which serves approximately 70,000 customers in Columbus and Gainesville, and they have written a letter agreeing. So, that's your favorite consideration on 209.
Thank you, Representative Weeks. Any member of the committee have a quick question? Hearing none, I'll take it we're ready for a motion. Motion second.
Discussion, hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, like sign. Senate Bill 209 passes.
Now, if Representative Weeks, if you would tell us about Senate Bill 210, please.
Chairman, also this session last year, I don't remember who said it, said housekeeping must be a real important part because they have a lot of bills. So this is another housekeeping bill for the Public Service Commission. Presently, if the Service Commission levies fines against a company, most of them, they agree to it or they agree to pay it or contest it. A lot of companies just don't respond, and so there's fines out there that then have to be collected through court action. What this bill will do is allow the commission to more effectively pursue fines levied by the Public Service Commission and unopposed by the respondent. A lot of people, and most of it is in our call before you dig bill, they just don't hear from us. And I might mention this bill wouldn't be retroactive. I think there are now 28 cases with total outstanding fines of more than $1 million, and there would not be, this would save or keep any more collections and bills or fines from being added to that matter. So it's another housekeeping bill I should urge for consideration.
Thank you, Representative Wicks. Any questions from the member of the committee to the our presenter? Hearing none, do we have a motion? A move from Representative Dodson, a second from. All right, any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor of Senate Bill 209 signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, same. What did I say? 210, I'm sorry. 210. We got anybody opposed? No. Senate Bill 210 does pass. Thank you, Representative Wicks, for doing that. All right, now to the good part. We have with us today Paul Genoa.
Genoa, I answered both.
All right, well, sorry about that, but we have Paul here. He flew down here today from Washington, D.C., from the Nuclear Energy Institute, and he's going to explain to us a little bit through a presentation about nuclear energy, and I think more particularly how it fits in with the federal energy bill that was passed last year. And I'm just going to turn things over to you, your presentation, and you just handle it accordingly, and we'll go from there. Thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Lewis. I appreciate this opportunity. Vice Chairman Murphy and committee members, thank you for this opportunity. And Abby, I have some color slides up here for folks' handouts. Also, there are a couple fact sheets on nuclear energy here in Georgia, and you can make those available at your leisure. And I guess I need to know how to control the tool to make this thing go. But I was asked to come down and speak to you this afternoon about the energy bill that was passed in 2005, the Energy Policy Act of 2005, and the nuclear title and the provisions in there. And I'm happy to do so. briefly going. And do we need to set it into slideshow format? Okay. Well, I thought I would give you an overview and of what was in the Energy Policy Act, what drove the act, what was the incentive for Congress to come together on this in a very difficult political climate and yet to pass out this substantial act. Well, it really had to do with America's demand for clean, affordable, and secure energy. And the question, why so many nuclear provisions? I'll show you that nuclear was not just in the nuclear title, but actually was in 75 sections of the Act. 8 out of 18 titles included provisions that impact nuclear energy. I'll try to go over what these provisions will do and what we in the industry are doing because of this, the passage of this Act. Maybe? Maybe not. Which button? Nope. The plus button? No? That'd be great. We're going to get to a manual presentation mode here very quickly, which will be just fine. Well, let me go over these drivers then for you. Again, probably the most fundamental driver is that energy security is a clear cornerstone of our national security. Absent energy security, this country is at risk. The second has to do with our competitive advantage in a global economy. I mean, being competitive today means having affordable energy. American jobs rely on low-cost energy. And finally, the environment. Americans want their cake and they want to eat it too. They want to have low-cost energy, but they also want to have a clean environment. Next slide, please. Well, this pie chart merely shows our energy diversity today. And all in all, we have a fairly diverse and reliable electricity distribution or a portfolio of generation sources. And you can see nuclear is about 20%, coal remains about 50%. Oil is very small, and that's because of the efforts we've taken since the 70s. And natural gas is up and getting larger. And hydro and renewables continue to contribute less than 10% altogether. Next slide. Now, as we look to the future, by 2030, we believe we will need to actually double our electricity generation supply. And that's a massive undertaking. The slide color here isn't the best, but that would require, if we kept the same energy balance we have today, that would require about 66 new 1,000-megawatt nuclear plants, about 93 wind farms at 100 megawatts each, about 150 natural gas plants, and almost 300 coal-fired plants. That's to keep the same mix that we have today. Next slide, please. This slide merely shows our generation per year, how we've added. And as you see the slide there, the different colors represent the different generation capacities. And overall, America, from the 50s through the 90s, generally had a pretty diverse portfolio of energy generation sources. But if you focus on 1997 to the future, you'll see that it's predominated by red, natural gas. About 98% of our electricity generation since this period has been natural gas. And that was for a variety of reasons. Again, in this country, a market-driven economy, you look at what is the least expensive generation to bring online, and you bring it online. Wall Street will reward companies who do that and punish companies who do not. The problem is what's best for an individual company may not be best for the nation as a whole. And so our reliance on natural gas now puts us in a non-competitive era for other things such as petrochemicals and fertilizers and various other clothing and fabric and textiles. All of these industries rely on natural gas for a feedstock, and yet now they're directly competing for natural gas for electricity supply. So really this chart summarizes why the Energy Policy Act was necessary and ultimately succeeded. Because left without the right incentives, without an energy policy, this nation would not go in the right direction, that we wouldn't have a broad overarching policy that would direct individual investments. Next slide, please. Well, so why nuclear? Why did people look to nuclear to help solve some of this problem? Well, first, quietly, since the 80s, nuclear energy has just quietly gone about getting better at doing its business. Today, our fleet average, we have 103 power plants in this country that provide about 20% of our electricity. They do so at about a 90% efficiency. In other words, of all the electricity they could produce 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, they do so at about 90%. And that is tremendous. As you can see, just as long ago as 1980, the fleet average across the country was just over 55%. So that's tremendous. That's the equivalent of adding about 23 new nuclear power plants across the country. And frankly, that is what the country has been relying on for the past few years, because we have learned to get so much more energy out of the existing assets. But we've got that about as far as we can go. Our best plants, the first quartile plants, are wringing about 95% of the energy they can out of the plants. And that's about as far as you can go, because you have to refuel these plants periodically, about every 2 years. And when you refuel those, even if it's 20 or 30 days of outage while you refuel the plants, that's where you see that drop in productivity. But still, 90% is heads and tails above other sources of energy. Just as an example, for planning purposes, you would think about 30% for wind energy, because it's just not available. The wind doesn't blow all the time. Solar, obviously, you only have half of the day with sunlight, and that's only if it's uncloudy. Next slide. Well, the next thing has to do with our production costs. As you can see, nuclear, the red line, has been fighting with coal all along since the early 90s, and we've been neck and neck. But in the last few years, we've even dropped slightly below coal. Now, we rely on coal for 50% of our electricity, and we will continue to long into the future. And frankly, there's quite a nexus between coal and nuclear. But nuclear now is the lowest cost electricity of our base load electricity providers. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at emissions issues, as I said, Americans want a clean environment as well. And you hear about renewable energy and non-emitting portfolio. Well, what is that non-emitting source of energy? Well, it has to do with hydroelectric, geothermal, wind, and solar, and nuclear power. In other words, what are the sources of electricity that don't put off various pollutants or greenhouse gases into the environment? Nuclear power is virtually 75% of that non-emitting source of generation. So what you have now is electricity that is reliable, cheap, safe, and clean. And that is something that is not shared by any one other energy source. Many other sources have some of those attributes. Coal is inexpensive, and it's abundant, and it's stable, but it doesn't have the environmental qualities. Wind and solar are wonderful and clean, but they're very expensive. So nuclear energy has a lot to offer. Next slide. And that is why it receives so much attention in the energy bill. Also, what we're seeing is that there's a renewed interest in nuclear energy. We're seeing studies across the country and, frankly, around the world looking at nuclear energy and its ability to contribute to the massive amounts of electricity we need here at home and, frankly, around the world in developing nations, while still maintaining our environmental quality. We're starting to see environmental groups. James Lovelock, he was the I guess, what do we want to call the Earth children of the 70s. I mean, he was the one who came up with the Gaia concept that Earth is really a living creature that adjusts and so forth. Well, he's finally come around to say, if you really care about climate change, you've got to look at nuclear power. You can't be serious otherwise. But there are others, too. Patrick Moore, the founder of Greenpeace, now is an outspoken advocate for nuclear energy. Next slide, please. And importantly, public opinion in this country, which is always, except for a few years there in the around the time of Chernobyl, has always supported nuclear energy in this country. And as you can see, we have been pulsing the public for more than 20 years. And we ask the exact same question. Do you strongly favor, somewhat oppose, or strongly oppose nuclear energy? And this is the answer we get year after year. And as you can see, we now enjoy the greatest spread. 70% of Americans support nuclear energy. Only 24% are opposed, strongly opposed, or opposed. Next slide, please. And it depends on the questions you ask, but we are enjoying the greatest support ever. As you can see, 83% of Americans believe that nuclear energy is part of our future. 70% favor its use. 74% want to keep the option to build the plants available. 58% believe that we absolutely need to build new plants. And a full 69% of Americans believe that it's acceptable to build another nuclear plant where one exists today. And of course, where plants exist today is where we enjoy the greatest support because they see the benefits. Next slide, please. Well, let's get to the specifics of the Public Law 10958, we call EPACT, or the Energy Policy Act of 2005. It renewed the Price-Anderson insurance for a 20-year period. This is the blanket coverage that the federal government provides in the case of some accident at a power plant. Those funds have never been needed, and those funds first come from the industry. So far, the federal government has not paid a nickel, and that has been around since the 50s. The second thing is standby support coverage, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but that has to do with some kind of protection to companies that invest in nuclear energy against delays that are beyond their control. For instance, regulatory delays or legal delays that are outside of their control to impact. There are loan guarantees that will help the first few plants deal with those first-of-a-kind costs associated with bringing plants online. So limited federal support or incentives for a limited number of plants for a limited amount of time. Another type of incentive is the production tax credit, $18 per megawatt hour. This is the same tax credit that wind industry and solar and others have been receiving all along. It now is available to all non-emitting sources. Matter of fact, it's available to all clean new plants. That would include clean coal, for instance. And finally, the contributions to our decommissioning trust funds. Many of you know that nuclear plants, not only does the cost of electricity pay for all the costs associated with running the plant, but it also pays for a fund to be set aside to clean up the plant once the plant is no longer operating, and it also collects money to pay for the spent fuel once it needs to be managed. So all those costs are already internalized. The problem was that as we moved into a deregulated market in parts of this country, and as we had mergers and acquisitions, Uncle Sam wanted a chunk of the tax money. He wanted to tax those decommissioning funds as they were transferred. And of course, that was never the intent of the funds. The funds were there to clean up the plants, to protect public health and safety. So this bill took care of that problem. There still are tax burdens on the trust funds, but they're much reduced, and they're now fair across both regulated and deregulated companies. Next slide, please. Some other issues have to do with substantial authorizations for research and development. Not only are we looking at new plants today, and as I'll discuss in a few minutes, the industry is moving forward to build new plants today, but we're also looking to the plants of the future, plants that will be available in 20 or 30 years, plants that will produce hydrogen inexpensively and give us the bridge to a hydrogen economy, allow us to wean ourselves from imported oil, plants that can produce clean water through desalination, plants that can produce processed steam for central heating or for manufacturing purposes. So that R&D goes on today. In addition, there are some security provisions in there that will direct the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to essentially establish in rulemaking the orders they've imposed on the industry for security. And we accept and support those orders and those rules. They've also highlighted nuclear issues by authorizing an assistant secretary position. There's a climate change as well that will be dealt with in the future that will recognize different technologies that can avoid greenhouse gases. And there are some hydrogen provisions for plants, whether they're nuclear, clean coal, wind, or solar, that can also produce hydrogen as a byproduct in an R&D phase. Next slide, please. Well, again, I talked about some of the incentives. As you may be aware, these plants are expensive. Whether it's a large coal power plant or a large nuclear power plant, these are multi-billion-dollar investments. Private industry has to make those investments. And this Energy Policy Act puts in place several incentives to make it easier for those investments to be made. The first has to do with a new licensing process. And in fact, this licensing process was put in place at the direction of the 1992 Energy Policy Act that Congress passed. They told the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to come up with a new licensing regime. In the old days, you had to build your plant and then get approval to operate it. So that you have a multi-billion-dollar plant sitting there for 5 or 10 years before you can operate and collect any revenue. Yes, sir? That would be an excellent example, and worse than that, they never, after they first started it, then they bought it for $1 and shut it down. That was a $5 billion investment. I think up in New England right now and in New York, they would like to have that power. Another is federal standby support. I mentioned this briefly, but this is support that would essentially ensure or provide some risk coverage for delays in licensing that would be beyond your control. This would be as if the Nuclear Regulatory Commission changed their rules in the middle of the process, for instance. That might be an example of what would cover it. And this would cover just the first few plants. It's just for the first 6 plants to cover those delays. The first plants would have more coverage, the later plants fewer. I keep mentioning just a few plants for a short period of time because we absolutely believe that our plants will be competitive after you get those first-of-a-kind engineering costs out of the way and after you demonstrate this regulatory process works. Next slide, please. There are federal loan guarantees. And these are guarantees on up to 80% of the project cost. In other words, the federal government doesn't provide the money, but they provide a guarantee on the loan. What that allows you to do is get better rates on better interest rates on those loans. Allows you to have a more highly leveraged capital structure. It reduces the project cost, gets those projects moving quicker. And as I mentioned before, there's a production tax credit. Again, this is just for the first. I believe it's for the first 6,000 megawatts. Our plants today are roughly 1,000 megawatts, so that's roughly for the first 6 plants. But that provides real significant advantages for those first few plants. And again, this $18 per megawatt, that's not just for nuclear, it would be for any clean power plant that comes online. And as I say, wind and solar have had those for years. Again, limited incentives for the first few plants. After that, we should be totally competitive. The market should be able to handle it. Next slide, please. Well, this may be a little bit hard for you to see, but it tries to give you a sense of the economics. If you were a power company and you were looking to build new generation, this is what it looks like today. At the top, you've got your combined cycle gas, and that's looking at a gas plant that's getting $6 per million BTU natural gas. Today, that's up around 9 or 10, and it was as high as 14, almost 15 a while before. The next one has to do with essentially your clean coal technology. And that also would enjoy the loan guarantees provided in this energy bill. And that's in at about $55. Pulverized coal, sort of the technology that provides most of our electricity today, down around $49. That's why coal is still king. It's a very low-cost energy provider. But with these new incentives, nuclear, and with that loan guarantee for the first few plants, $46 per megawatt, and that right now would be the lowest cost provider for your base load power. That's assuming that we could build these plants for about $2,000 per kilowatt installed capacity. We think that's a little bit high for the first few plants, and we think that about $1,500 is right once we get these plants, after we've demonstrated the first few and we've gotten those first-of-a-kind engineering costs out of the way. So we're looking very good. We're very bullish on nuclear at this point. Next slide. Now, I get the questions all the time. I actually got the question earlier today before the hearing started. Well, when are we going to get the first new order? When's it going to happen? When's the next order happening? When was the last order? Well, it's a logical question, but it's really the wrong question, because there is no one decision point in making, or there isn't just a single decision point to make the decision to build a new plant. Today we have it organized so that there really are three distinct decision points in the process. And the first step is to go ahead and file what we call a combined construction operating license. We have many plants, I think 9 now, going through that process. They haven't committed to build a plant, but they're spending real money, about $50 to $90 million a piece to do this. So that represents between $500 million and $1 billion investment the industry is making today. But that investment is not a decision to build, it's a decision to get ready. And those things, having that license, that is good for a 20-year period so that they could make a decision any time to go forward. The second decision comes in just about 6 months before you would expect to get that combined operating license approval from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or 12 months. And that's when you would start ordering long lead time items, large components, the reactor vessel itself, steam generators, electrical generators and turbines. This is the same thing we saw happen in natural gas when we were building the natural gas plants. Our companies were building them 12 months in advance, buying them. Again, it's not a decision to build because those are fungible assets. You could always go ahead and sell that turbine generator set to someone else who had a more aggressive building schedule. But finally, number 3, and this would happen about 7 years into the program, is that's when you would really decide to break ground and build the power plant. The beauty of this is that all of the regulatory hurdles are now behind you, and you have great confidence that once you build the plant, you will then operate it successfully afterwards. Next slide, please. So what are we doing as an industry in response to this Energy Policy Act and the provisions in it? Well, we will get another early site permit in 2006. I should tell you that our licensing today is really sort of a 3-step process. You've heard about France, the fact that they're 78% nuclear electricity. Well, that's because they standardized their reactor design. In America, we have roughly 103 individual plants. It's not quite that bad, but almost. That's because we sort of believe that we can, every utility felt they could build that. There's just a little bit better. And we designed as we went. Well, today, that won't happen. Today, you would take a design, submit it to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and get it certified in advance as a standardized design approved for use. We have 4 of those already approved. Then you would go and you would say, I would like to evaluate building that plant on my site. And you would do the environmental issues. And you'd look at all the permitting associated with that. That's what we call an early site permit. We have multiple companies working on them. We believe that we will get one this year and 2 more in 2007. Those are approvals that say that, yes, you can build that plant on this property and you can bank that permit for 20 years. We also have 9 companies or consortia of companies that are working on a combined construction operating license for submission to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2007 or 2008. This would represent somewhere between 12 and 19 reactors that would ultimately be built. And so this is already going forward. These companies are already spending serious money to get licenses to build those plants at some point. And then finally, there's one new design that was just certified this year, and that is the AP 1000. That's the Westinghouse design plant. and there is one more in review. And if we could have the last slide. This, while it'll be difficult to see, it's on your handouts. This is a rundown of what is going on today in new plant space. As you can see, the number of reactors there, as I mentioned, represent, some people are hedging their bet. I'll build 1 or 2, I'll build 2 or 4. So it's somewhere between 12 and 19 reactors. And you're most interested, I'm sure, in Southern Company's evaluation of the Vogtle plant and whether it would be appropriate to build 2 new plants, 1 or 2 new plants there. And they're preparing their combined operating license there. But they have not determined what type of reactor at this time. So none of these companies have made a definitive decision because they're not that far into the process, but they all are spending real money evaluating it to see if it makes sense when the time comes. And with that, I'll take any questions you might have, and thank you for your attention.
Well, I certainly thank you, Paul, for doing that and making that presentation. I do have a few questions from the committee members, and I'll start with Representative Smith right here.
Thank you. Is this on? No?
Yes, it is.
Going now. Okay. Thank you for being here. I can't hear myself, but thank you for being here. I had a number of questions. I'll try to hold them down to it. One, I got here late. You might have talked about Yucca Mountain and the approval of that. That's one consideration that has to be moved out of the way before you move forward with this, obviously. Is there some truth to that? Or?
Well, that's often stated. I did not cover the Yucca Mountain repository program. And as I say, I think having not only Wall Street but public confidence that the spent fuel disposition issue will be addressed properly is necessary for new plants. But we do have a plan in place. It is a long overdue plan, but the federal government has the responsibility. We do have a plan for that. They are proceeding with the licensing of Yucca Mountain. Representative Smith, you were out there. You saw the scientific work that went on out there. That licensing process is it is probably a year and a half away from submitting the actual license itself. The Department of Energy, which is responsible for for submitting that license, is in the process of redesigning their program. That program originally envisioned receiving fuel from around the country, opening the containers, mixing the fuel up to optimize the heat load, and putting it in the mountain. Today, they've announced a decision not to proceed that way, rather to receive the fuel in canisters, leave it in canisters, store it on aging pads, and ultimately put it into the mountain, all clean, not handling the fuel over and over. The industry supports that decision. We also, you may have seen today in the Washington Post, there was a story about nuclear energy and used fuel management. And I would tell you that we are on the cusp of perhaps a policy debate on used fuel management. Not only the back end for non-proliferation reasons around the world, but for the front end. If we really are going to build that many new plants, not only here, but around the world, we don't want then uranium to become a high-priced commodity. We don't want to put too much pressure on that. And many of you may know that when we fuel our reactors for 2 years, and we only take out 1/3 of the fuel every 2 years, so the fuel bundles themselves stay in the reactor for roughly 6 years before they need to be removed. But they're not removed because all the energy value is gone. They're removed because of fission products and so forth. There are many countries around the world, 12 actually, including France, England, Japan, Russia, that reprocess their fuel afterwards to extract that energy value out, build new fuel out of it to operate new reactors. I think that we're on the cusp of a policy debate on whether the U.S. should take that sort of an approach. But regardless of that approach, you will always need a deep geologic repository like Yucca Mountain. And so we believe that the repository program will continue to move forward.
Real quick question.
Yeah.
First new plants. How many is going to be considered first new plants on page 8?
That would receive incentives? Yeah, we're looking at about 6 plants, roughly.
Plants, okay.
For the first 6 plants, for a limited number of time.
And then you had a slide that showed the cost of energy, gas on down to nuclear, and you had a lot of caveats there depending on debt equity and so forth. Roy Bowen represents industrials there. How much longer can we wait before the industrialists start to see a huge line item in their budget because of energy if we don't move on this?
They have already seen it. I think you'll recall before the last presidential election, all the discussion was about jobs leaving this country, outsourcing America. It was on 2020. Well, why do you think the jobs were leaving? It was because of high-priced energy costs. The Gulf states have lost 100,000 workers because of the cost of natural gas. They can't afford to use it for a feedstock to produce fertilizers, to produce petrochemicals, and so forth. So I think we've already reached that. We're already impacting our economy, and I think that's why we were able to get this energy bill passed, so that we would make some smarter long-term decisions for America.
Then I have one final one. I have several, but this one is relating to existing facilities. We have one in Georgia, 2 in Georgia. How many locations across America have enough room for expansion, say another 1, 2, 3, 4 reactors on the existing site?
Virtually all of them.
And what's the maximum number of reactors they could put in a site?
All the sites are different, but our sites typically are large, fairly large open areas, because we try to have exclusion boundaries to keep the plants away from populations. But many of the plants, Palo Verde is one of the plants I worked at. There are 3 units there. It was designed for 9. There were many plants that were sites that were designed for 6 or more plants.
One follow-up, Mr. Chairman. If you've got a site like you're alluding to, we're talking about, how much easier is it to get approval there than to go to another site?
Well, you would think it would be a lot easier.
A new site, I mean.
You would think it would be a lot easier. Currently, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is taking 3 or 4 years to decide whether it's acceptable to put another plant next to an existing plant. This is a site that's already pre-approved, already designed, all the studies have been done, and yet it still takes 2 or 3 years. But I would say from a public opinion or from a local community, the acceptance is very easy. And for a company to make the decision, it's very easy, because think about it, at an existing site, you already have the transmission lines run. It's difficult to put in new transmission lines. That's already there. Water sources are already available. A trained workforce already lives around the facility. The community has been used to living around the power plant for many years, and so the public acceptance is pretty high. So it's relatively easy, and virtually all of these plants are looking at building them at existing sites.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Smith. Next series of questions have come from Representative Ron Forrester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Paul, for your presentation. And actually, Representative Chairman Smith, I think, took all my questions. So I think he gave about 8 of them. So, no, one point of clarification was the Shoreham. When I mentioned Shoreham, what I wanted to mention there was it was a plant that was built there in New York, and and you said a $50 million expense?
About $5 billion.
$5 billion, excuse me. And then it was closed down and sold for
$1.
Nothing. So that deterred a lot over the years, a lot of investors, a lot of utilities from proceeding with building plants, and that's why we've seen no growth over the last, since I was at Watts Bar when we started it up in 96, I think it was. Point of clarification. Another plant out in California, is San Onofre or
Well, San Onofre and Diablo Canyon, both operating, but they were supposed to come online for about $250 million, $350 million, and they ended up costing $3.5 billion. And this has to do with a regulatory process that requires you to get a permit to build, then the rules change while you build, then you have to apply for a license to operate it, and you have to go back and rebuild and rebuild and reapprove, and there is no end to it. And ultimately, the costs were extraordinary. Now, almost all of these plants that you're talking about were envisioned, were pushed forward because of the oil embargo in the 70s. Right. And yet, after 3 Mile Island, there was an additional regulatory concerns and regulations imposed on the plants, probably appropriate, but the design of the regulatory process just left those plants hanging out there for many years. The longest, I think, were 10 years after the plants were built before they were allowed to operate. And if you remember back in the 80s, it was double-digit inflation. Now, you just think about $5 billion for 10 years, how much interest that is.
And one other thing you mentioned...
And that is fixed today. Excuse me. The new regulatory process does away with that. We're going to try to show that that will work now.
Okay. And you mentioned Chernobyl, and people shudder at the words Chernobyl. People need to know that none of the designs, except for one that's now shut down, I believe, in the United States, was designed like Chernobyl. They didn't have the safety containment features. And that was an extraordinary situation where a government entity was trying to run a test and made the operators override the shutdown signals and keep operating. A very extreme situation that wouldn't happen here in the United States.
Well, that's true. We don't, that reactor was designed not only to produce electricity but make plutonium for weapons.
Right.
Our commercial reactors are not designed that way at all. That reactor was designed without a containment. Ours have containment. That reactor design had graphite that can burn like a charcoal. Ours have water. It can't happen. Right. But nonetheless, there's been such tremendous hype and misinformation as well. If you were to look at the United Nations, there's a group that studies radiation incidents, and look at their results. Chernobyl was a terrible disaster. No one can argue that. But less than 50 people died. Even today, there's been less than 50 people. It was a terrible tragedy, serious harm, but it's been the stories in the papers aren't anywhere near the reality.
And one final point, the last slide you had showing the sightings, most of these are at plant sites that now exist. And there's a document called the Preliminary Safety Analysis Report that was done for this plant that became the final safety analysis report that does all the environmental aspects and design aspects for operation of the plant. And I was surprised to hear you say that they're not being able to use that document in the siting.
Well, what I said was you would expect that after a regulatory agency had already approved a site for a facility, you would think that it would take an in-depth but very quick review. But instead, we're looking at maybe 3 years to go back and review that site to put a reactor that is probably an order of magnitude safer than the original operating reactor that's there.
Thank you.
Next, Representative Murphy.
Thanks for your presentation, Paul. This has been very good. What is the average cost for a one-reactor plant?
I think we're looking at about $1.5 billion.
And then if it's a two-reactor plant, would that double, or would it be a little bit less?
A little bit less.
So 2.5?
Yeah, we're looking at about the slides I showed were about $2,000 per installed kilowatt, or $2 per installed megawatt, I guess is what you'd look at. So, I mean, about $2 billion for that plant for the first few. But then after we get through the first few plants, we believe that would come down to about $1.5 billion.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Representative Smith.
I think one quick one about Homeland Security. If you would address that issue.
I certainly would. Many of you who have visited our plants know that our plants were the most secure civilian facilities even before 9/11. Since that time, we've spent nearly $2 billion enhancing security at those facilities. We've added, we have now about 8,000 armed guards at these 103 facilities across the country. We have better coordination now with our state and local law enforcement and with the National Guard and so forth, and Homeland Security. So all in all, there have been extraordinary efforts made to take what is already a very low probability event and reduce it even further. So I'm very comfortable. I would be comfortable and have before lived near plants.
Thank you, Representative Smith. Anyone else have a question? I've got just a few, if you don't mind. I know we're getting on into the hour. I want to just go back to Chernobyl was mentioned. And it seemed like I remember in the late 70s, 3 Mile Island, there was an incident there. And if I believe I'm describing it accurately, they called it a meltdown. Is that right? Would you mind telling us what a meltdown looks like?
Yeah, I'll try to give you an image of it.
I know you've probably never seen one, but
no, I've never seen one. But we in fact did create a partial meltdown at a reactor near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. What happened was a series of events occurred that demonstrated that operator training and control room design were not optimized, so that the control room operators misinterpreted the results that they were getting during an event. There was an event where a piece of equipment stuck. It allowed some water to leave one of the components in the reactor. They envisioned that the scenario needed to be fixed by stopping the water flow into the reactor. This is precisely the wrong thing to do. We like to kid that if they had been asleep at the wheel, the reactor would have shut itself down properly and the event would not have occurred. But in fact, operator actions were taken that actually impacted and damaged the core. So what happens first is uranium fuel that's used in our reactors is a uranium oxide. It's a ceramic. It's much like a coffee mug, only it's in small pellets that are a little bit bigger than an eraser. They're black, and they are in long tubes, which are fuel pins. Those long tubes are then grouped into what we call an assembly. Those assemblies, multiple assemblies, are put into a large reactor vessel that, think of it like a pressure cooker. Water goes in the bottom, takes the heat away from the fissioning process, carries that off to become steam, turn the turbine, make electricity. If you stop the water, the reactor heat has nowhere to go. And if you allow that heat to build up high enough, it actually will damage the metal tubes that the uranium fuel is in, and ultimately can actually damage the ceramic itself. And at very, very high temperatures, it would just melt into a slag at the bottom of the reactor. And that's partially what happened at 3 Mile Island. That material stayed in the reactor itself. Some of the fission products inside went off into the rest of the containment structure, into the bottom of it, where we have recirculation to keep water coming back into it. And a small amount of gases build up inside the containment and were purged over time. The big problem that everyone remembers with 3 Mile Island is that there was evacuations. These evacuations are because NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission engineers, believed that there was a chance of a hydrogen explosion in that containment. It turns out that those calculations were in error, and in reality, the evacuation was never necessary. Nonetheless, all of our plants around the country are designed with emergency protection zones, emergency preparedness zones, where we have routine drills designed so that if you would ever need to evacuate or shelter, which is the more likely thing to do, is to stay at home and just allow any release to pass over. But again, that was the only release we've had in this country. It has been exhaustively studied. The amount of radiation that someone could have been exposed to is roughly about what you would get from one chest X-ray. There were many, many suits filed about damages. None were ever proved. There have been many studies by not only Pennsylvania Health Department, but other groups to show that although we ruined a reactor, well, we didn't hurt any people.
Well, this may be an obvious follow-up to that, but did that incident impact where we are now and in the years in between now and the late 70s as far as bringing on more nuclear capacity in this?
Absolutely. What happened was, first, I'd have to say that it was, you have to look at all these things and try to find the silver lining. What we learned is that we did need to do a better job of training. We did need to have a redesign of our reactor control rooms. But we had about 300 plants ordered, and about half of those were never built, and that's directly related to 3 Mile Island. But the good news is all of the plants were improved. All of our operations are improved because of that. So the industry learned a lot. It was a very difficult but really valuable lesson.
Thank you for that. I want to change gears just briefly. On the slide, we talked about we'll be using 50% greater electricity in the year 2030 than we are today, and you show your mix of coal-fired, natural gas, wind, and nuclear. In order to supply that 50%, is that the suggested recipe, if you will?
No, that was merely looking at our mix today and saying, well, if you scaled that up to meet the future demand, that's what you'd have to build. The reality is you probably shouldn't build that much more natural gas. We ought to learn how to build more clean coal and probably more renewables and more nuclear.
Well, if you wanted to meet that 50% greater demand and you just went with nuclear, hypothetically, how many nuclear plants would that possibly be?
More than we can build in that time. It would be, I think we were saying the coal plants are about 400 megawatts, and there are almost 600. So you need almost 2 of those for every nuke plant. Because in reality, our plants coming online are going to be between 11 and 1,350 megawatts.
Well,
so it'd be a lot, a couple hundred.
A 600 megawatt coal-fired plant, is that just an average megawatt size, or does that fluctuate, or is that what you shoot for when you build a plant?
I'm not an expert in that. I don't know. I believe it was probably an average size.
Well, on the nuclear reactor, it mentioned 1,000 megawatts. Is that about an average, or is that?
Yes, it is. Although, as I say, our new plants coming out will likely be slightly larger than that, about 1,150 for one design and about 1,350 for another.
In the federal energy bill, you mentioned in some of your slides some of the incentives for early plant approval or early approval, some risk coverage, federal loans or federal guaranteed loans, and that sort of thing. Now, I'm not going to presume that you know the inner workings of our Public Service Commission or any other states related regulatory, but what would the relationship be between the Nuclear Regulatory Agency and a PSC when it comes to permitting a nuclear plant or a new reactor here in Georgia? Can you expound on that a minute?
I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding would be in regulated states such as Georgia, the Public Utility Commission would have to make a determination that there was a need for more energy. Once they'd made that determination, they would probably need to make an evaluation of what would be the appropriate energy to bring online, the appropriate technology to meet whatever your goals are within the state. It might be just low cost. It might be low cost and diversity. There may be a range of policy initiatives that you try to impose here. Some states have renewable portfolio standards that might play into that. But ultimately, once they made the decision that would essentially enable the funding to go forward to build the plant, then the company that wanted to make that investment then independently would go to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to ask for approval. So one is really more of a financial prudency. Does this meet the needs of the state of Georgia? The other has nothing to do with that and has to do with safety and design. I should say you still have to put forward an environmental impact statement, because this would be a major federal decision. And that has already been done in general terms. There are some specific issues that would get at, well, are there other alternatives other than a nuclear plant? Is this the right thing to do, and so forth.
One point I wanted to try to make in asking that question, when it comes to these guaranteed federal loans and these other incentives that you mentioned, and when a utility applies for more generating capacity here, they can also request rate recovery. Would these incentives that are built in here, could that affect rate recovery for these facilities, if at all?
It would reduce the need for as much rate recovery. It ultimately would reduce the cost of power to the state of Georgia.
Okay. Thank you. That's what I wanted. That's all my questions. Representative Smith, do you have another question? Anyone else have another question?
250
Instead of 60.
Thank you.
And as you pointed out before, through my drilling, we had about 300 that were scheduled to be built last days, and we ended up with a little over 100. So I would like to
It would take a significant increase. I'm not saying Americans aren't up to the task, but, absent heroic efforts, man on the moon kind of stuff, 250 would be a stretch. But we probably could do 50. But what I would tell you is back in the 70s, we had the capability in this country to make large components. We could make reactor vessels. We had the best steel making in the world. We had the best foundries and forges. We don't have that anymore. We can't even build them in this country. We have to go overseas to buy it. When I talk about long lead term items, you're not going to buy them from the U.S. You're going to buy them from Japan. Now, I think the current administration would like to see America regain its leadership in this technology, and we certainly would support that.
Well, let me conclude this by first thanking the members of the committee, and also thanking you very much for your willingness to come down here and explain to us a little bit how nuclear energy fits into the federal energy plan, and hopefully it will give us some ideas of what we can do, because I agree with you. I enthusiastically support the idea of nuclear generating capabilities, not only in this state but in this country. I think it's where we ultimately need to go, and yesterday was not soon enough. So without any further comment, again, I express my sincere gratitude. Thank you, everyone. We are adjourned.
Thank you very much.